Who was Bronko Nagurski, and why is there an award named after him? That's the subject of our video today. Welcome to Hardcore College Football History, where history meets the gridiron. Bronislau Bronko Nagurski was born on November 3, 1908, in Rainy River, Ontario, Canada. His parents were from the Galicia region in Europe, which is part Poland, part Ukraine. At the age of 4, his family moved across the border to International Falls, Minnesota, which is known as the nation's icebox. When his International Falls classmates had difficulty pronouncing Bronislau, his first grade teacher changed his name to Bronko. Now, this shouldn't be shocking, as immigrants at the time were accustomed to having their names changed. His father had had his name changed at the Canadian border from Nicholas to Mike. Bronko worked on his parents' farm and sawmill and worked in the timber industry. All a perfect environment for turning him into an incredible physical specimen at an early age. Nagurski began playing high school football at International Falls, but tried to transfer to Bemidji as they were a better team and offered a better chance of being recruited by a college. The Falls coach complained, and the Minnesota High School Athletic Association suspended Nagurski for the season. Nagurski ended up playing his college ball at the University of Minnesota. One story of how he was discovered comes from the Minneapolis Star from March 1, 1982. In an article entitled "The Bronc, Nagurski Lives So Quietly Many Townspeople Don't Know His Legend," Dr. Clarence W. Spears was the head football coach at the University of Minnesota from 1925 to 1929. He is the man who discovered Bronko Nagurski. As the story goes, Spears was driving past a farm when he saw a muscular boy plowing a field without a horse. When Spears asked for direction, the boy pointed with the plow. "What position do you play?" Spears asked. "Everything," the boy replied. "When the other team has the ball, they put me where I can make the most tackles, and when we have the ball, I carry it." Now, it's a pretty cheesy story. It's also the same story that Bob Devaney used to tell about how he recruited farm kids in Nebraska in the 1960s. But I don't think anybody in Nebraska in the 1960s would have still been using a horse-drawn plow. It's a really cheesy myth, but a great origin story. But as we continue, you'll see that it's just one of the amazing stories about Bronko Nagurski. In 1926, Nagurski enrolled at Minnesota. At 6'2" and 235 pounds, a giant in his era and a decent-sized player now, Nagurski possessed the power of a lineman with the speed and agility of a back. In his senior season in Minnesota, he was clocked at running the 100-yard dash at 10.2 seconds. From Jim Dent's book, Monster of the Midway, Bronko Nagurski, the 1943 Chicago Bears, and the Greatest Comeback Ever, what a title meant for search engines, we get the story of what happens when he arrives at Minnesota. Spears wanted to test the Bronc in a drill called the Nutcracker, a 3-on-1 testicle rattler that was relished by the coaches but reviled by the players. 2 men would block against one, while the running back tore through the hole paved between the 2 blocking dummies. The defensive player's odds of winning this battle were equal to mighty Notre Dame going winless for an entire season. When Spears wanted to rub a player's face in the mud, and he was often in the mood, he called for the Nutcracker. The blockers were all-conference linemen Ken Haycraft and Bob Tanner. The runner was fullback Herb Joesting, dubbed the Owatonna Thunder by the sporting press. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds of cold steel. Bronko dipped into a 3-point stance, aiming his headgear between the 2 giants across from him. On the snap, he tore through the blockers and dumped Joesting on his back, pinning his knee to a blocking dummy and bending the joint. The big fullback cried out as the trainers sprinted onto the field. Spears couldn't have cared less. He blew his whistle and dispatched yet another running back into the fray. The ball was snapped, and Bronco once again split the blockers, driving his shoulder into the ball carrier's sternum for a 3-yard loss. Yet another and another was handed the ball with the same result. Spears finally sidled up to assistant coach Dutch Bergman and whispered, "I think we've seen enough." Spears had not expected this. Nagurski's football resume spanned all of one season with a team that did not win a game. The coach expected Nagurski to be green and overmatched against the hardened boys from UM. Freshmen were not allowed to play in 1926, so Nagurski spent the season being a blocking dummy. In 1927, the Gophers went 6-0-2, tying Illinois for the conference title. Illinois had gone 5-0 in the Big Ten compared to Minnesota's 3-0-1, but the two were considered co-champions until the president of Minnesota, Lotus D. Kaufman, declared, "As far as Minnesota can see, there is no tie. Illinois has the title. Minnesota has sufficient victory in the great record of the maroon and gold team. Our record is sufficient. Claims to the title could add nothing to it." Sports writers went insane. Spears threatened to quit, but remembered that Nagurski would be around for 2 more years. Nagurski moved to fullback in 1928, still playing tackle on defense. The Gophers lost 2 games, to Iowa 7-6 and Northwestern 10-9, to destroy any hopes of a Big Ten title. Nagurski played against Iowa with 3 of his ribs torn away from his sternum. Against Northwestern, he cracked 2 vertebrae. He continued to play. Wisconsin was the last game of the season. The Badgers were set to win the Big Ten title. With 2 minutes left to play and a scoreless tie, Nagurski demanded the ball. From Jim Dent's book, we get the following. Nagurski's face was streaked with blood. Blood leaked from a hole in his forehead. From the 20-yard line, he burst through the line right behind Gibson's block. He was hit at the 16 and shook it off. He ripped through another tackler's arms at the 10. 2 Badgers jumped on his back at the 8-yard line, and another wrapped his arms around the Bronc's neck at the 7. 2 more piled on at the 4, and another leaped aboard at the 2. While the Wisconsin fans stood and railed against this piston-legged madman, he carried 6 men on his back into the end zone, and then he shook them off like so many horseflies. The 6-0 defeat cost Wisconsin the Big Ten title. The Gophers, having completed a 6-2 season, roared west on the Silver Bullet all the way back to the UM campus, where the party was on. The town was already talking about Nagurski's senior season. The 1929 Minnesota team did not win another Big Ten title, going 6-2, losing to Iowa 9-7 and Michigan 7-6. His father Mike and mother Michelina came to see his last college game against Wisconsin, the only game they would ever see their legendary son play. Nagurski responded by rushing for 137 yards, scoring a late touchdown for a 13-12 victory. Nagurski became the first All-American to be named to 2 separate positions in the same year. The Heisman Trophy didn't exist until 1936. Were it available in 1929, Nagurski would have won it going away. The NFL draft didn't come about until 1936. It started as an effort to stop bidding wars between owners. So instead of being drafted, Bronko Nagurski was bought for $5,000 by George Halas of the Chicago Bears. He was first offered $2,000, but held out. Halas had Nagurski sign a contract while still on the field after his final college game, the East-West All-Star Game in San Francisco. When he returned to Minnesota, Nagurski found that Tim Mara, founding owner of the New York Giants, had offered him $7,500. This was just a couple months after the stock market crash of 1929. Nagurski's legend grew by leaps and bounds in the NFL. There is a story about the Bears playing at Wrigley Field against the Cardinals and how cops patrolled the sideline on horseback. Nagurski, pursued by 3 Cardinal players, ran toward the sideline and hit one of the horses at full speed, lifting all 4 hooves off the ground. Jim Dent says a snapshot was taken by a lucky photographer. He describes it as saying, "The horse flying straight up, the cop suspended about 2 feet above the saddle, his mouth agape, his eyes like saucers, his hat flying out of the frame." Now, I never found this photo, but that would be really cool. Other stories are from the Minneapolis Star article in 1982. The old-timers tell of the time Nagurski crashed over center against the Redskins, knocking 2 linebackers in opposite directions. Next, he stomped over the defensive halfback and felled the safety. Then he caroomed off the goalpost and crashed to a halt against a brick wall. Finally, he staggered back onto the field. "That last guy hit me awfully hard," Bronko Nagurski said. There's always variations of these stories about how he made a crack in the wall or, different guys hit him, things like that. Nevertheless, when Nagurski reported to the Bears as a Paul Bunyan from the Northlands, the veterans were skeptical. Cal Hubbard, a 270-pound Green Bay lineman, longed for a shot at the publicized rookie. Early in the first meeting between the Bears and the Packers that season, the Bears got ready to line up in punt formation. Just before the play, Hubbard propositioned Red Grange, one of the Bears' protective blockers. "Red, I promise you I won't block the kick," Hubbard said. "But you'd do me a favor if you'd step aside and let me get a clean shot at Nagurski. I want to test him out." Red obliged, and Nagurski met Hubbard head-on. Hubbard landed on his ear. "Please don't do me any more favors, Red," Hubbard said. "Something strange happens to the tackler of Nagurski on making contact," Grange said years later. "It is like receiving an electric shock. To tackle him above the ankles is to expose oneself to being assassinated." Now, Nagurski helped the Chicago Bears win the first ever NFL championship in 1932 as they faced off against the Portsmouth Spartans. The game was held indoors at Chicago Stadium due to cold weather. There had been a circus the week before, and elephant dung remained on the field during the game. Chicago won 9-0 with the Bears scoring on a controversial touchdown pass from Nagurski to Red Grange. Controversial because Nagurski threw the ball from near the line of scrimmage instead of being 5 yards back from the line of the scrimmage, as the rules at the time required. The first title game was so popular that the NFL decided to have a title game every year after that. The Bears won again in 1933. In the 1934 championship game, the Bears lost to the New York Giants 30-13. The Giants scored 27 unanswered points in the fourth quarter after switching from cleats to sneakers on the iced-over field at the Polo Grounds. And Nagurski goes on to play for the Bears until 1937, but he also starts another professional career in wrestling. He plays football in the fall, then wrestles in the winter. He had a contract for $5,000 for football, which would be nearly $100,000 today, but his contract had decreased each year. Remember that this is during the Great Depression. Players like Nagurski and Red Grange were frequently paid in IOUs because the Bears, George Halas, didn't have any money. The problem was Chicago Bears owner George Halas and New York Giants owner Tim Mara had both lost their fortunes in the 1929 stock market crash and were simply trying to keep the NFL alive. Nagurski needed money. His father had lost his store, his sawmill, and his construction business. He'd resorted to bootlegging, but the feds caught up with him and threatened to send him to Leavenworth. He agreed to stop bootlegging and took a low-paying job at a paper mill, and then that closed down for over a year. Bronko wanted to save his family farm, and he had another big reason. Nagurski had married Eileen Kane on December 28, 1936. They would go on to have 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters: Bronko Jr., Tony, Ronald, and Kevin, and daughters Eugenia and Janice. Nagurski demanded a raise to $6,000 in 1937, but Halas turned him down, so Nagurski quit football to become a full-time wrestler. He had success in the National Wrestling Alliance. He became a major box office attraction, although he would later say in his life that his wrestling career was a bit degrading. From Dent. At first, the Bronc had tackled the wrestling circuit with the same zeal that had driven him to the pinnacle of the pro football world. He might be in Provo, Utah on Thursday, in Philadelphia on Sunday. Wrestling was cheap entertainment throughout the Depression years, and promoters were prospering with the big names: Lou Theis, Whipper Billy Watson, Dean Denton, Ali Baba, Ed Strangler Lewis, Leering Lou Plummer, and Nagurski. When Tony Stecker called to say that Lou Theis was ready to rumble in Montreal, Nagurski was normally on the next train to Canada. By the summer of 1943, though, Nagurski had seen enough of the slimy sport to know that he could stomach it no more. He had been ripped off by promoters, hucksters, and arena managers from Los Angeles to Bangor, Maine. Plus, he was growing homesick for his wife and 2 boys back in International Falls. Bronko Jr. was now 5 years old, and Anthony had just turned 3, and he missed his wife every day he was on the road. In 1943, 6 years after he had left the Bears, they called him to see if he'd play tackle. There were so many players who were serving in World War II, the Bears were shorthanded and somewhat desperate. Nagurski agrees, and he's back in the NFL at the age of 35. In the final game of the regular season against the Chicago Cardinals at Comiskey Park, the Bears were down 24-14 after the 3rd quarter. They needed a win to hold off the Packers in the Western Division. Nagurski spent the first half playing tackle, but the Bears need points. They called on Nagurski. He lined up at fullback for the first time in 6 years. They gave him the ball, and he ran up the middle over and over and over until he scored on a 1-yard plunge. The score breaks the Cardinals. The Bears scored 21 points in the 4th quarter to win 35-21 and clinch the division title. In the NFL championship game, Nagurski scored off tackle on a 3-yard touchdown run in the Bears' 41-21 victory over the Redskins at Wrigley Field on the day after Christmas. The touchdown is his final play in his storied football career. After the NFL, Nagurski served as an assistant coach at UCLA for 1 year. And then he went back to International Falls. He made wrestling appearances off and on until 1960. Then he bought a gas station and created yet another legend. It's said that he had so many repeat customers because he screwed the gas caps on so tight, he was the only one that could get them off again. He retired in 1978 at the age of 70 and lived in a cabin on Rainy Lake on the Canada-U.S. border. It's an understandable place to retire. The winters are tough, but in the summer, it is one of the most beautiful places on this earth. His wife Eileen passed away in 1989, and the following year, Nagurski died of heart failure in International Falls. He is buried at Forest Hills Cemetery next to his wife. In 1951, Nagurski was voted into the College Football Hall of Fame in its inaugural class. In 1963, Nagurski was part of the charter class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, along with George Halas and Red Grange. In 2000, he was voted the 2nd greatest Minnesota sportsman of the 20th century by the sports writers of the Star Tribune, just behind Minnesota Twins Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett. In 2003, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp collection which they called Early Football Heroes. The 4 people on the stamps were Walter Camp, Red Grange, Ernie Nevers, and Bronko Nagurski. In 1993, the Football Writers Association of America, the FWAA, created the Bronko Nagurski Trophy, awarded annually to the best defensive player in college football. I find it interesting they chose to give the Bronko Nagurski trophy to a defensive player, given most of the stories you hear about Nagurski are of his offensive prowess. Perhaps it's in honor of his origin. Bronislau, his real name, Slavic in origin, means glorious defender. I'm John Johnston, and this is Hardcore College Football History. If you like this video, please subscribe and tell your friends and family and everybody else you know. Maybe their pets. And if you like this video a lot, please consider subscribing to me on Patreon to support me making more of these videos. Thank you.